There's a spell I'll never tell. Yeah, I like you, that's for sure. Never have to close the door.
Hi guys, welcome back to Exmo Lex. Today I want to share more stories of leaving the Mormon church that you guys have sent in. I've done a couple of videos like this before and you guys always seem to enjoy them, and personally I love hearing these stories as well. It's validating and relatable and makes you feel like you're not alone. So these stories were all sent in by viewers. If you want to share your own story, you can send it to my email address, exmolex@gmail.com, and make the subject line something like exiting religion. It doesn't matter if you left the Mormon church or if you left a different religion, I would be happy to share any of those kinds of stories here. Just keep in mind that when I request stories like this, I usually get several dozen, so I might not be able to get to all of them. I hope you guys understand, and like always, all of these stories will be kept anonymous because not everybody tells me whether or not it's okay to share their name, so I just like to err on the side of caution and not disclose any names. With all that said, let's get started. The story of my faith transition is a little different than the ones you have shared. In fact, it looks a lot like yours. I was a TBM, double-dipped 100%. I'm from a South American country, and at the age of 8, 2 missionaries knocked on my door. My parents got baptized and I was just following their example. So I was into the cult from primary, served a mission, married in the temple with a returned missionary too, and my last calling in the church was a branch president, like a bishop, here in North Carolina. I moved to the US in the 2000s. Throughout my entire life in the church, there were a few little things that I placed on the shelf. One of those was blacks in the priesthood, because my mom was black and my dad white. However, the tremendous effort the church makes to distract you to look the other way and keep you busy with serving in the church never left a moment to think entirely about this horrendous doctrine. The beginning of the end of my faith started in 2020 when the pandemic hit. It was required to stay home and do your own church meetings. That gave me and my wife the opportunity to study Mormonism more in depth, for things that we heard but never cared to investigate because our callings kept us distracted. Without noticing, we ended up on the CES letter, then Mormon Stories podcast. We spent countless hours reading and researching what we heard on the podcast and what we started to learn about the complete history of the church until we found the gospel topic essays. The feeling is like falling into an abyss, and when you think you're at the bottom, you start falling some more. Horrible. My wife started this journey before me, but hers was more introspective than anything else. She was able to perceive the cognitive dissonance in some of the teachings, people's behaviors, doctrines, and culture. However, after a good 6 months, we were done. Imagine 40 years of devout service, countless hours of your life just dumped. We believed in something that was supposed to be the complete truth, the real thing, believed in a God that required our time, money, and even our lives for his church. I'm still in a rage just thinking about it. This whole experience left me sick of religion in general and pretty much atheist. I wouldn't call myself such, just because some of my identity is strictly related to some teachings of Jesus Christ. But my journey into other spiritual sources is just beginning. The excitement of the open road in front of us overcomes the anger, sadness, and sense of frustration we could ever feel. Thank you so much for sharing. Something that I've noticed with a lot of the stories that have been sent to me recently, probably at least a good half of them, if not more, became disillusioned with the church during the pandemic, when there was a break from in-person meetings. I actually did a whole video about that at the end of 2020. If you want to check that out, I'll leave a link in the description. I am 17 and the youngest of 4 to very TBM parents. Growing up, my father has been the bishop twice and has always been a part of our high council for as long as I can remember. I started having minor doubts about 5 years ago. I began struggling with depression and have been coming to terms with the fact that I might have been queer. I struggled with knowing about the church's stance on the queer community. I was upset with the church, but still didn't feel like it wasn't true. I was accidentally outed to my parents, which led them to sending me to a Mormon therapist. There, I shut my feelings away and began to rededicate myself to the church. I began to be the most involved in the church that I had ever been. I was on the Young Women's Council for a long time, enjoyed my time at Trek and EFY, and I even earned my Young Women's Medallion and Honor Bee in 1 year, which I had been very proud of. I slowly started to develop a sort of superiority complex within my family, seeing as one of my siblings had left the church and the other 2 were questioning. I felt like a sort of Nephi figure, the holy child amongst the religious siblings. Thinking that I was so spiritual and that nothing could break me, I approached my brother hoping to understand his side and possibly bring him back to the church, a silly thing for 14-year-old me to think I could do. He began to pour out to me his experiences and feelings over things he had learned. Over the span of a month or so, we had a couple conversations where he introduced me to the ideas of the flawed history of the church and a bunch of the immoral practices that we often overlooked. This led me to start questioning myself. This was also when quarantine happened, which gave me time and self-reflection I needed, and after reading the CES letter, it was over. It took a while for me to readjust and come to terms with a future that didn't seem so clear to me anymore. Who was I if I wasn't going to go on a mission, attend BYU, marry a man, or any of the things I had set out for myself? The world was now filled with endless options that honestly scared me. I finally told my parents, who took it fairly decently even though they were TBM. I'm pretty sure being the fourth child to leave also helped, so they kind of saw it coming. A few months later, I also came out to them as a lesbian, which was shocking and harder for them to grasp. It is still hard being such a young ex-Mormon. As much as I ask, my parents are adamant on not letting me remove my records, which requires parent permission for minors. It is also very weird coming back to school after quarantine, a whole new person, and ultimately losing a large majority of my friends. It's difficult, but it's always getting better, and I'm so glad I get to dedicate the rest of my life to how I want to live it. I've gotten to finally meet myself and learn about a person I didn't know existed underneath the church-created persona that I was. And to be honest, I love the real me far better. I really related to this person saying that they felt like a sort of Nephi figure in their family. I also went through one of those phases as a Mormon, cringy as it may be. One of my brothers had left the church, and the other one seemed like a really progressive Mormon, which to me, being raised in an Orthodox, very conservative Mormon household, seemed like he wasn't being Mormon enough. I told you it was cringy. But thank you for sharing your story. I'm really glad that you decided to send it in. Mormons and ex-Mormons who question at such a young age and end up putting their foot down and deciding to make their own decisions are truly powerhouses. I'm proud of you. My story is still a bit unfinished, but I think sharing it might help someone else. I never really questioned the church until early 2020. I listened to Rhett and Link's podcast on their spiritual deconstructions after being raised in a fundamentalist Christian religion. It spoke to me in a way I wasn't expecting. Before then, I had never even allowed myself to consider if I really believed in the church. I felt like if I even thought about it, God would know, and I would never dare look at anti-Mormon literature. But suddenly, I wasn't even sure if I'd ever believed. I was a hard rule follower in nearly every way with the church, but I never felt like I had a relationship with God. I always felt inadequate for not being able to make myself read the scriptures or pray daily. Now I know that was largely my undiagnosed ADHD, but at the time it caused so much guilt and shame. I have still never read the Book of Mormon past Alma. Lazy learner and lax disciple alert. I said I had a testimony because that's what everyone does, and I thought I believed because it's all I'd ever known. Soon after, I started recognizing things that I didn't even know had been on my shelf. I'd always been bothered by the pioneers. Why would God put them through so much suffering and loss, and for what? Polygamy always confused me, but I never really gave it much thought. My biggest shelf breaker was the church's homophobia. I never understood how a loving God could make someone LGBTQ+ and then tell them it's an awful sin, when loving who you love and being who you truly are hurts nobody. Every other sin had a rationale, a reason it was harmful, but I could never wrap my head around how gay marriage could be such a terrible thing. Not to mention, my best friend has been openly gay since we became friends. Why would God condemn such a wonderful person who was nothing but kind and genuine? I remember thinking that I didn't want my future kids to be gay or trans only because I didn't want them to be hurt by the church. Through lockdown, I began feeling less and less connected to the church, but I still did a lot of thought stopping. But one day, earlier this year, I read the CES letter, and then, a few days after, church came up in a conversation with my best friend. I spilled my guts about everything I'd been thinking about and how I'd been feeling, and of course, she was so supportive. But saying it out loud suddenly made it real. My shelf broke that night. I decided I was done. Since then, I've listened to so many Mormon stories and watched tons of other ex-Mormon content creators. I've started drinking tea, I've tried coffee, I swear. When meeting new people, they know me as just having been raised Mormon. I have no faith left in the church, and I still don't know if I ever did have faith. I have no clue how to tell my mom. I'm in college, but I live at home. I do everything I can to avoid attending church without raising suspicion. My mom is a multi-generational conservative Mormon. My sister left 4 years ago, so I know she'd never kick me out and our relationship wouldn't drastically change. But with my sister, we all saw it coming. With me, I feel like my mom has no clue and would be completely blindsided. I can't even fathom having the conversation with her. Honestly, all I can do right now is hope that I can slip out of Mormonism quietly when I move out in a few years. But that aside, I'm so glad I left, even if I'm not totally out of the woods yet. I feel so much freer, and it's given me a path to work through so much of the guilt I've lived with my whole life about not being good enough. And the best part is, I'll get to have a real wedding. I also felt like my family would be really blindsided by me leaving, and honestly, they kind of were. But luckily, my side of the family has been really wonderful about accepting it and accepting us. There were definitely some challenges, especially more towards the beginning, but I feel like now, like 3 years in, some of those relationships are better than they ever have been. My husband's family, well, that's a different story. If you've been on this channel for a while, you probably know all about that. However, he also has a brother who is still Mormon, and he and his wife get along with us famously. But thank you to this person for sharing your story, and all in all, I hope the best for you. I hope that things are going better than ever when you're able to live your life more authentically, and I totally agree, having a real non-Mormon wedding will be absolutely beautiful. I was raised in the church with my mother's lineage coming from pioneers, and it's even mentioned in the Doctrine and Covenants. I tried really hard to like church, but it never fully clicked for me. The shame and guilt and judgment were easy for me to take on, but I could never find the dedication or willpower to want to pray or read scriptures or participate in anything. It didn't help that I'd get punished for not being ready for church on time or for missing seminary, and the punishments were usually pretty harsh. I grew very resentful of the church, and many times I felt like questioning things, but shut it off quickly as I felt my mind was leading me astray. I had a period of time for my senior year and several months after where I had left and was doing my own non-Mormon things until my family really guilted me into coming back, which I did. Again, I tried hard to be good and ended up moving out to Utah for several years, where I met my husband and got married in the temple. We never really talked about religion though, and neither of us was ever proactive about attending meetings, praying, or reading scriptures. I liked that because I finally had an environment where I could start shedding the guilt. It has taken a long time though. Our attendance quickly fizzled out early in our marriage, and we haven't been. And even though I stayed away for so long, it wasn't until this past year that I knew without a doubt that I believed nothing from the church, or any organized religion for that matter. Once I decided I was leaving, I started having nightmares about being trapped and trying to run away in the middle of the night. I think that stems from that moment of realizing my whole world has been a lie and feeling like a prisoner to this cult. All I want is to be free of the fear, guilt, shame, and judgment that has held me back from living a normal life. But it's so deeply ingrained in me that I don't know if I will ever be fully free. I am riddled with flashbacks of the judgment I used to pass upon people, and it makes me sick to my stomach. I made so many people feel bad for their life choices over something that was completely made up. My new calling in life is to finish my bachelor's degree and work for the ACLU or a civil rights lawyer so I can fight for those people I was unnecessarily nasty to in my youth. I'm really fucking sorry, y'all. P.S. My siblings who convinced me to reactivate 14 years ago fully left the church several years ago, and I'm only a little bit annoyed they dragged me back in and left me with my feelings. But it's nice having people on my side of the fence. I loved this story because I feel like sometimes the stories of people who aren't like 100% invested in the church and 100% faithful can be kind of overlooked. This person mentioned that the church never fully clicked with them and they didn't really like the way the church made them feel. And that's just as valid as somebody who is a Molly Mormon. The feelings that they have and the way it affects them even after they've left is evidence that the church's teachings affect all the members. Thank you guys so much for sharing your stories. I appreciate it. The viewers appreciate it. So if you guys liked this video and you liked hearing these people's stories, leave lots of love and support for them in the comments. Remember, if you guys would like to share your story, you can send it to my email, exmolex@gmail.com. Huge thank you to my patrons for supporting the channel. You guys are the best. Special thank you to Craig Call, Doug Davis, Mormonland, the guiltiest place on earth, Jason Wilkins, Tans, and the Exmo Candle Company for supporting at the Demon tier on my Patreon. If you guys would like to support the channel, you can find links to do so in the description below, as well as links to all my other social media if you want to see more content. Thank you again for being here, and I'll see you next time. Bye!
Never revealing no secrets you're keeping. These promises strong as a spell. I'll never tell.